Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Green. Thank you, Michael and Lida, for hosting us. And I'm representing on behalf of a group of people who were working day and night during the pandemic to cover what was happening to different communities across India, particularly from the effects not just of the pandemic, but from the restrictions that were being imposed around it. Dr. Thiagarajan has already mentioned a lot about what was happening in India on the public health spectrum and much beyond that. I'd like to start by making you all see a small video. So just give you a sense of what we were able to unpack. It's just a minute long, but I'll try to give you a sense of what was happening, not maybe just in two cities, but across India.
ये डाली में एरिया लगता है, डाली में स्कूल एरिया, यहाँ पे हम लोग का अड्डा लगता है, यहीं से लोग आते हैं लेवल लेके जाते हैं, बट इस टाइम पे हम लोग का काम इतना डाउन है कि समझिए पेड़ के लाले पड़े हुए हैं। कोई नहीं, दो बच्चे वो पढ़ रहे हैं, पढ़ाना भी बहुत जरूरी। हाँ, वो खेती होती है ही नहीं सर। हाँ तो भैया कोई नहीं पूछा, गए थे 10-7 बजे, आपस आ गए, मतलब 5 दिन हो गए लगातार जाते हैं आते हैं जाते हैं आते हैं।
Yeah, thank you. So if you just get the presentation back on. So what is this concept of Mazdoor Mandis is these are informally organized markets where just people get up in the morning to reach out and they're looking for work which is being provided by contractors or is what they're called, or brokers who, and this is very common back not just in India, but I think in Brazil, South Africa, I mean many countries, it's very common to have informally organized labor markets. What we did during the pandemic was we experimented with the method of documenting the research we were doing. And one of the larger reasons was that much like what I see in conferences, workshops such as these, is our focus on the data and methodology overrides much of the agency that we're trying to locate in respect to determining what vulnerability and precarity is, also who is at the most receiving end. So what we thought was using visual anthropological techniques, we'll try to document what we are doing through survey work. And the paper which is out there is circulated, so you can get a set of the facts of what was happening. But also we make an attempt or, in a sense, get a picture from the voices of people who were at the receiving end what was happening. So this is a part of two studies. One study is going to go in tomorrow, and today is a study on informally organized labor markets and what was happening during that period of time in 2020, 2021, and much of the period, I would say, in 2022 as well. There's a period of time between 3 years. March 2025 is when the most stringent lockdown was placed in India. It was a curfew. Plain and simple, it was a curfew. Nobody was allowed to get out of home. And police were instructed to use as much of force, brute force, to let those who are on the street be back. So you can imagine that with 90% of India's workforce in the informal sector, and it's the word informal, I'm talking about those who are not recognized by the letter of law. That's it. The conceptualization of informality in itself is deeply problematic, but there's a lot of work which has come in from scholars in the global south on, and much of the work which is happening now across the world, that the semi-urban, urban, rural migratory force is less and less recognized in the context of the work and the numbers that are being put around, right? So when I'm using the word informal, I'm talking about those who are the seen but unheard group of workers in a way to discuss their perspectives. In India's context, it's 90% just of the workforce, but also within that, 85% are women, right? So it's a long uh, uh, cycle, or I would say period of time where women, children, and workers between the age of 15 and 50 are part of the workforce. So what we started doing through the method of using visual techniques was to look at this specific set of workers across different communities. Now, within the center's research, which was happening way before the pandemic, our work was in urban informality, addressing some of these. So we were positioned at those clusters where workers were already based. And what we started doing was documenting in the period of time when the lockdowns were put in place, what was happening to those communities. As you know, almost 80%, and this was called as the second partition almost, where people started walking on barefoot back to their homes because they couldn't find transport. There's some images that you'll see as we go forward. But a lot of the issues that came out from the research questions we were looking at highlight the problems that were pertaining prior to 2020. And I would say that the exacerbation of that was a function of the apathy, indifference, or ignorance of the state, which failed to acknowledge some of these issues which have been there as part of the supply side economics contract of jobs that have been created much from the 1990s in India. There's a history in which the employment landscape has been faced. As a result of that, you see that the effect of the pandemic's restrictions on these communities was seen in that level, or in that phase. So uh, if you look at through, and I'll sort of try to talk through some images and then sort of give you the data on that, the number of people rushing back to the homes as when they were trying to uh, look for opportunities to reach home. The concept of home in itself for them very much dependent on where the native rural village towns were. The whole reason of moving to cities and the impact of those was they were moving to cities for work, and as that there was no work now, there's no point in staying there. But it's not as if everybody wanted to go back. Wherever they used to stay, right? Wherever people were staying, they didn't let the landlords or those who would put them on rent did not let them stay because they felt that they could spread the virus. And as a result of that, they didn't have a place to stay in as well. So the communities we were looking at, the cities that we mention of in this study particularly is Lucknow and Pune, but we'll work around 8 to 10 cities in India, different states, to get a perspective of what was really happening. So on the methodology, you will see how you use visual ethnographic techniques and anthropological work. There is, in your lunch time, a series of photographs that we put on an exhibit that you can walk and see through. It will be there today and tomorrow, so you'll get a sense. Jignesh was a photojournalist who's taken those photographs, unfortunately couldn't come, so we've tried to put that on an exhibit to give you a sense of the work that happened. So I'm just going to sort of move past some of the images to give you a sense of the problem of spatiality, the context of vulnerability, and also for the community that is at risk. Much of the work that was coming from ActionAid, ILO, and many other researchers have talked a little bit about what was really happening. So there is a lot of context which is already there in the literature. The point is, when you look at the community of workers within that, it's important that we make or get a sense of who are we really talking about, what is their profile, what is the nature of work that they're coming in from, and what's happening on the gender and spatial dynamics of this. I'm going to ask Ashika, who's one of our research students who was working this particular project, to just be able to log in and speak up on a couple of the findings, and that's when we can close the presentation.
We had about 195 or so respondents. Only about 20 or so of them were women. Despite this, there were large negative impacts on them, which will be coming to it in the presentation. We also saw that the respondents that we had interviewed were mostly married individuals from the age group of about 31 to 40. And we also saw that only about 2 of the 195 respondents had completed higher education. And when we had sort of studied this correlation between education and income in the sort of manual physical labor space, we recognized that the correlation was relatively low, and there were other aspects of their work which largely contributed to identity, to the home state that they were from, which Professor Deepanshu had mentioned, but also the average experience that they had held. So if I could draw your attention to the graph on the screen, which you could see that construction labor, which is sort of the lowest tier, is the largest amount, and construction contractor is sort of the least. And the difference between them is more attributed to their experience as opposed to anything else. The next few slides are a few visuals from the field. So this should give you a sort of spatial context of not just where they wait to get work, but also their residence. Our first primary finding was with regards to the declining wages. So in Lucknow, we saw that the mean daily wages fell from about 4.22 pounds to about 3.53 pounds. And in Pune, this was marginally low, sort of decline from 4.41 pounds to about 3.82. But we also saw that there is a limited variation within the same category of work. For example, we saw construction workers, which are primary number of respondents, especially private contractors, who now had large bargaining power over the set of employees and could offer them work at a much lower rate. One of the respondents actually told us that they were ready to take work at about 2.5 pounds, which is less, or like close to half of what they had got before the lockdown. There was also a lack of a formal labor union, which is present in other sort of service sectors in India. And owing to this, these laborers form smaller clusters in order to negotiate their wages with their respective employers. So that is sort of the larger trend that we saw with respect to wages. The next slide, that carrying both from wages, is also how much they spend. If I could once again draw your attention to the graph on the screen, you would see that pre-lockdown there was a larger, monthly income as opposed to expenditure, which is the case normally in a household. But post the lockdown, we can see that there is greater expenditure as opposed to income by quite some amount. And this lends to the space of indebtedness, right? And in India, debt collection within these informal sectors happens usually from community, or loans are taken from family members at informal interest rates, even from local money lenders, and not really from formal institutions such as banks. And the reason for this being that there is a need for collateral aid and also for documentation, both of which these sort of informal laborers couldn't provide. We also found a correlation between dependent family members. These are two types. One is ailing or senior citizen, and others are girls who are the age of marrying, which in India falls around the age of about 20, 19, 20, of that sort. And the expense for marriage in India is called dowry, which is sort of the lump sum amount along with an asset that is given off along with the bride, and the bride is married off. And for these households that is at the lower income, this forms probably the largest expense in their lifetime.
The situation in India, in fact, I would say went far worse on access to finance for borrowing or getting people out of the debt crisis they were impeding on, which drove them to the informal lending space, which, as you know, is deeply exploitative, and what you call as the loan sharks are much more deeply prevalent in rural areas. So I'll pause on here. There are a few details that we'll sort of bring into the conversation also when we have a discussion on this tomorrow, particularly on the gendered implications of what the respondents were experiencing. I know there's a whole session today which talks about women, so it would be interesting to look at that. With that, I'll say thank you. Thank you, Professor Glenn. Thank you.